Hello and welcome back to the Dovetail box series. In this video, we're going to begin construction of the lid. Let's get going. So in the previous episode, we got the bottom of the box flushed off, the outside's flushed, and it's pretty much at the stage where we're ready to attach a base. We're not going to do that at this point because what we might as well do is get the lid constructed in clamps and gluing, and then while that's drying, that's where we'll attach the base. It's just a bit more efficient to do it that way as opposed to attaching the bottom, gluing the top, and then watching it, waiting for it to dry. You might as well try and do two things at once. So I've got 3 pieces of material prepared for the lid of the box, and these have been cut about 3mm oversized, 1/8 of an inch or so. That way, once all of them are glued together, we can then flush off these 2 faces in order to make it fit within the carcass of the box perfectly. So what we're going to do first is orient these pieces so that it's a happy medium between something that looks nice, i.e. flipping it around so that the grain matches nicely on the joins and it flows nicely and there's no sort of weird imperfections that are going to be visible within the joints, and balance that with constructing a lid that is stable, i.e. it's not going to cup, it's not going to bow, it's not going to twist over time. A big part of this is finding a balance between something that looks nice and is actually going to last. So let's start with aesthetics, choosing timber for aesthetics, because that's the easy one. It's down to your own creativity, and what I say looks right may not look right to you. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but there's a few things that I'm about to say that may spark your imagination or make you think differently about things. I don't know. When looking at a piece of timber on the face, there's 2 grain patterns you're likely to see. One of them is straight grained. The grain goes straight down, top to bottom, and this is generally seen on quarter sawn timbers and rift sawn timbers. The other type you're likely to see is this, where the grain curves up in arcs. You know, sometimes it might have some sort of like weird sweepy thing going on with it, but generally it's going up in arcs like that as opposed to going straight. This is crown cut or through and through sawn. Lots of different names for it. These are known as cathedral patterns or crown cut grain patterns. It's generally something you see on through sawn timber or crown cut timber or simply square sawn timber. Those are the 2 things you're most likely to see. So let's just rub that off and start again. We're going to be joining 3 pieces of timber, and within those pieces of timber, we're either going to have straight grain or cathedral patterns. Now, we'll just reiterate what I'm about to say is my own personal taste on things. It's not something that you should necessarily stick to, but it's just worth knowing. If we've got 2 pieces of timber that are straight grained and 1 piece that has kind of swirly grain going on with it, generally what you want to do is make the outside ones the straight grain and the inside one the curly grain, like that. The reason is, if you look at a normal piece of timber that has been flat sawn all the way through, what you get naturally in that timber is straight grain transitioning into curved grain, transitioning back into straight grain. Doing it this way just looks a little bit more natural. It's more likely to hide those glue lines and make them less visible and kind of just make that look like one solid piece of timber, which is generally more sought after in furniture as opposed to sticking lots of little sections together. If you can make it look like a solid piece of timber, then you're onto a winner. Now let's move on to the next one. If you have 3 pieces of straight timber, then it's pretty simple. You can pretty much just get away with sticking them together and that's it. The only thing I would look out for in these instances is if the grain was kind of trailing off diagonally on one of them, you probably don't want to make it trail into it on the opposite one, because that will just make it more obvious that you've got lots of bits stuck together. Instead, see if you can make it trail across diagonally, like that. Once again, the grain will kind of all blend in, it will hide those glue gaps and you'll get a much better joint and result from it. Another instance would be if you've got 3 crown cut boards with the 3 curved patterns on them. In that instance, you're probably not going to make it look natural, so you might as well just embrace the fact that it's not natural and make it look pretty cool. So for this, I would do curved patterns like that in the middle and then do opposites on the other side, so that when you look at it, you've got this cool like wavy pattern going on. As the saying goes, if you can't fix it, make it a feature. And the other thing we haven't covered is if you've got 2 crown cut boards and 1 straight grain one, again, it's not something you can really hide naturally. I would either put the straight grain down the middle like that and just make it look symmetrical, or if you're lucky, you could try and blend in 2 cathedral patterns either side and then have a straight grain one on the left here, or on the right, whichever side it ends up being, that may end up blending into one of those. Obviously, wood is a completely natural material. There's no saying what the grain is actually going to do. It's never going to look this even. It's just one of those things you've got to cut it open, play around with the timber and see what looks right. But usually, if you can make it look as natural as possible, straight, curved, straight, then that's a really good thing to aim for. So on these boards, I've kind of got a bit of a mix between the two. I've got some curved patterns going on here, but then it's straight, curved, straight, and then there's a bit of a wider grain there, and this is going straight as well. First thing I've noticed, there's a defect there, so that is going on the outside. I don't want that there. So let's see, we've got a bit of grain going off diagonally here. What can we blend into that? So we'll flip it around this way. We've got a bit going off like that, which looks quite good. We've got any other options? No, that looks a bit naff. Again, there's a bit of grain going off that way. I reckon that is what we'll go for. That looks pretty good. And then moving on to this side, so we've got some wider grain here, which is then transitioning into straight grain. Got some nice straight grain here as well, so let's match those up. Looks pretty good. Just double check. Nah, looks a bit rubbish, that. The only thing that's annoying me about this is the colour match down here. I think that's looking much better. So we'll go for this. So in an ideal world, what I've picked out here is what I'd like to go for, but this is where the whole finding a balance between stability and looks come in. So you're now looking at the timber from the ends like this. You're looking at the end grain here. And that end grain can tell you a lot about what may potentially happen to the material if it's subject to humidity or uneven drying, or even just generally de-stressing over time. So with the end grain, if you've got arced grain like this across all three pieces, and they're all arcing the same way like that, that's a recipe for disaster, because what happens with arced end grain like that is these growth lines actually try and straighten themselves out. So what you'll actually have here is, with this one trying to straighten itself out, this one straightening out, and this one straightening out, what you'll end up with is a curved lid. And you can imagine trying to get a curved lid on top of a flat box is an absolute nightmare. So although we love the look of those lovely swirly patterns we just oriented in the previous step, the fact that they have the curved end grain can cause a few issues. This is where quarter sawn timber can be slightly nicer to use with its straight grain, because what you have on the end grain of quarter sawn timber is growth rings that go down perpendicular to the top of the material. So in this instance, what the lid's going to do is it's just going to shrink top and bottom like this. And that is going to be by a very, very minuscule amount. This material isn't thick enough for that to be noticeable. So don't worry about that at all. But that's why quarter sawn timber will be best for this lid. However, quarter sawn timber can be quite expensive and is also sometimes quite difficult to source. It's usually easier just to buy simple through sawn timber with the curved patterns on it, thus giving you the curved patterns on the end grain. So the best thing you can do at this point is, let me just redraw this again. The best thing you can do is orient it so you've got curve up, curve down, and then curve up. Now these bits of timber, they are going to try and bend potentially, but the least you can do is stick them together in a way that may cancel out any of that error that's caused. So with this one is going to smile up, and then this one is going to bend down, and then that's going to smile up again. So you might end up with a slightly bumpy lid, but then you just skim over it with a plane to flatten it off. Again, these pieces aren't really wide enough for it to cause excessive cupping, but with wider components, then this is definitely something that you want to take note of. So let's have a look at these pieces we got here. We might be lucky. So this one is pretty straight, to be honest. There is maybe a little bit of arcing going down like this. Oh dear, that was awful drawing. But you get the idea. It's kind of scooping down like that, but to be honest, it's mostly straight, so I'm not too worried about that. This one, that is arcing up. So that's looking pretty good so far. And then this one, again, that's pretty straight. Let's have a look at the other ends. Okay, that end's definitely arcing down. So it's arcing like this. So as you can see, what we've got here is two pieces of material with less than ideal end grain. What's going to happen is this one is going to bend up potentially, and then this one is going to bend up, and this one is going to bend up even more. What I'd like to see here is flipping this one over so that we've got a scoop down, up, and then down. But looking at it from above, that's where the compromise is, because we've lost that lovely grain pattern that I had on there before. That's a real shame. So as you can see, it is a little bit of a compromise having to get the balance between the aesthetics and the stability side, but I would definitely put the stability before the aesthetics, to be honest, because you know, you can have a lovely looking lid, but then if it's bending all over the place, you're gonna have to throw it away and replace it anyway. So stability comes first, aesthetics, unfortunately, come second. So I'm gonna have another little play around with this and see what I can come up with. I'll see if I can find something that looks good, but also satisfies the stability side of things as well. Okay, I think I've got something here. So what I'm going to do is get the edges all nicely lined up and then draw a big triangle across all three of those components so that if I was to accidentally get these all mixed up and I can't remember how they go together, that triangle is an easy way of putting them together and making sure everything is aligned as it was before. So with these pieces of material, these have been machined on the planer and thicknesser, and to be honest, the joint between the pieces looks pretty good at first glance. A lot of people would just call that done at this stage and stick those panels together and that's it. But what you've got to bear in mind is with a planer and a thicknesser, when this material is going underneath that spinning cutter block, that is not actually creating a perfectly flat face. What it's doing is taking out a series of tiny little scoops all the way along the material so that they're so small you can't really see them, let alone feel them for that matter. But if you stick two pieces together with that kind of ripple pattern going on between the two components, that's going to affect your joint. You want to get rid of that, which is where hand planing these edges come in, because a hand plane is going to give you a perfectly flat face, providing you have the right technique, and it's going to give you an invisible glue joint. The other thing we're going to try and achieve here is a spring joint, which is a way of ensuring that when you stick these components together with an invisible glue joint, they stay together with an invisible glue joint. You don't get any gaps open on it. And that's what a spring joint can do. If we're looking at that joint from above, as I just showed you, so there's our joint right down the middle. You're looking at it from this angle at the moment. With a spring joint, what you aim to do is put a very shallow hollow along here and on here. Now this gap in the middle is minuscule. It's a couple of shavings thick. But what happens with this spring joint is when you put pressure from here and here and you close up that gap, therefore creating an invisible glue joint, what you've done is you've packed more fibers into the top than you have in the center. The reason for this is to prevent any gaps from opening up here and down here. Let's pretend that we didn't do a spring joint. And in fact, what we have here is two pieces of timber that are just stuck together with perfectly flat edges. With timber's like a series of straws going up, and air wants to escape from those straws and therefore dry out the piece of timber. But what happens with timber as it dries out is it shrinks. Now these being long straws, along this piece of timber, where do you think is the easiest place for the air to get out from? Yep, here and here. So because the air is able to escape these areas quicker than it is in the middle, it means that this area is going to shrink, this area is going to shrink, this is going to shrink, and this is going to shrink. Therefore, opening a gap like this and like this. And this is exactly why this piece of Paduke that I've got here has a split at the end, and there is a little split down the bottom here as well. It's because the air has escaped out the ends quicker than it has in the middle, and therefore it's shrunk there and shrunk there, shrunk there and shrunk there. This is a solid piece of timber. There's no glue joint in this, but as you can see, it still rips itself apart. It will definitely do it to a piece like this if you don't create a spring joint. So as you can see, a spring joint would prevent this from happening by packing more fibers into these corners here and these corners at the top. Therefore, if they do try and shrink, there's more compression up there to allow for those areas to shrink without opening up any gap. It's really difficult stuff to picture, so don't sweat too much if you don't understand it, but all you need to know is aim to get a spring joint in this. So enough talking about a spring joint, let's actually make one. So we've got the piece low in the vise, and we'll get a plane and just start doing a few shavings in order to get that edge perfectly flat. There we go, that was a full length shaving there, so we're nice and flat on there. Just need to double check that it's actually square. All right, so that's looking a little bit higher on this right hand side. I'll just put a line along there just to show me where. And because I've got a curved blade on this plane, if I center the plane above that high side, it's going to take more of a shaving off there than it does on the low side. So if you haven't already, have a look at my video on how to get a stupidly sharp edge on a plane blade, because it will show you how to put this curve on it and therefore help you with this stage of the project. The other video that may be useful here is squaring and dimensioning material by hand, which talks you through every step of flattening and squaring an edge. Both of these will obviously be linked in the supporting resources. All right, so that's looking flat, square, only a couple of shavings needed, and that is ready for us to put the spring joint into it. So with the spring joint, what we're going to do is take a shaving that is this long, so we'll land here, take off here, and then we'll do a slightly longer one and slightly longer one. We probably only need those 3 shavings in order to do this effectively, especially if we're going to do it on this component and the other one. So let's do that in practice. Get the plane nice and central, take off, and there we go. That's the spring joint. That's all it was. Let's get the corresponding components. So it's that one there. Get this in the vise. Let's flatten off that face first. Oh, I think it's going against the grain there, so I'll just flip it around and go that way instead. Much nicer. Okay, so full length shavings are produced there. Check for square. A bit high on this right hand side again. So pencil line on there just to show me where it is. Let's get it centered above that. All right, try again. Short shaving, slightly longer one, and then just stopping. We're pretty much stopping like 10 millimeters shy of the edges when we're doing this final cut. You have got to be pretty precise with it. There we go. And what we should see here is a joint, when we put it together, will become invisible. So there we go. What you're seeing here is a small shadow from this component overhanging this one. If I push that together, you can see it's pretty good. But the main places I'm looking here are the ends. And it looks like there's actually a small gap down here, which I'm not happy with. See, right down here, minuscule little thing, but it's hard to know which component you actually need to take that material away from. So what I do here is slide the material down, and if the gap persists, that shows which one the material needs to be removed from. So if I slide this one down first, gap disappears. So if I slide this one down, the gap stays there, which means that this piece is dropping off slightly. So here's the corner dropping off. Let's get the plane right up, probably about 5 millimeters shy this time. All right, go through and then lift off. Let's see what that's done. Gone. How about that? Very nice. But what we should be able to see with the spring joint gap now is if we lay them on top of each other, you can see it touches on the side, then becomes a little bit hollow in the center, and then as we get to the other side, tapers up to touch again. And there you go, that's your spring joint completed. So with this, edge joints in general, to be honest, what you should be able to do is close that gap with just the pressure of your hands. This is a little statement that came from Ben Crow from Crimson Custom Guitars. They have a YouTube channel as well. I'll pop a link to it in the top corner. But a statement he said in one of his videos that really stuck with me is, if you can't close a gap with just the pressure of your hands, then you haven't done your job correctly. And like, I love that. I think it's awesome. If you're having to rely on clamps to mush this thing together, you haven't done enough. Hand pressure should be all it needs, and then the clamps are there to supplement things a little bit. So let's just do this once more. I've got these two components needing to join together now. So a couple of long shavings going all the way through. Check for square. Oh, nowhere near. Rubbish. Okay, so I've squared the sides of these ones, and it's pretty obvious to see at this point, gap there and a gap there. This is actually something that a plane excels at doing. They're not great at flattening off surfaces. What they're very good at doing is creating arcs, which is another reason for the spring joint, because it counteracts this arc from being created by creating one in the opposite direction. So with this, the fact that there's a pretty visible gap either side, it's going to take more than just 3 strokes to hollow this out. This is going to be something that I'm just going to have to do by eye and just keep going until it looks right. The only difficult thing with this being the fact that I've got to take a lot of shavings off means that there's more potential to put this out of square. So as you create the spring joint, just keep checking it as you go and correct any errors before they become massive issues. All right, So I think what I produced there looks pretty good. As you can see, when I push this one together, no gap there, no gap at the top once I get a bit of pressure on it, and we're just left with a small hollow in the center that we should be able to close with just hand pressure. Looks good. Again, the gap you're seeing here is just a shadow. If I push that down, it completely disappears. Very happy with that. Now, there are certain instances with this where no matter how much you try and get that joint perfect, there's just going to be little hairline gaps in places. Just double checking this one at this point. Yeah, this one looks fine. But if you take this to a point where you've got too much of a spring joint, or there's little gaps in places where you just can't figure out how to get rid of them, sometimes what you can do is just a shaving all the way along it, nice and even. And then shaving on this one as well. That's going to even out any little bumps along the way, bring it into being square a bit more. And although it reduces the spring joint, it just evens things out to make it a lot better. And in fact, actually that has actually improved this slightly. Once again, no gap, tapering into a tiny gap in the center, moving along to then close up once again. That's exactly what we're going for. And there you go, that is how you construct a lid for aesthetics and stability. So with this step, there is a lot of supporting resources, all of which are listed below. Have a look at that because it will really help you out with planing these edges flat and square and everything. It's a lot trickier than I just made out, trust me. I remember struggling with this for hours beforehand. So just take your time with it. You're now ready to move on to the next lesson, which you can do so by clicking the link below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe by pressing the big round button to the left-hand side of this video. Best of luck with this stage, guys. See you in the next video.